Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So it is finally September. We are finally at the fall cusp season. Very excited. Fortunately, it's still like 80 degrees outside, so my AC is still on, which means I apologize for the hum. Hopefully that will be over very, very soon. But today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I've touched on this very, very briefly before. But I got this idea from Juan over at Plagued by Visions. Last November, he asked me to take part in a most disturbing book I've ever read kind of YouTuber collaboration. And it was really fun for me because I don't actually think I read a lot of disturbing horror. If you go over to Plagued by Visions, I'll have all of that linked down below. You will see that he reads just so much disturbing horror on every type of level of it, and he rates it and ranks it and talks about it all the time, and he has a whole series on it, and it's awesome. But it's just not the type of horror that I ever read. And so I was on Reddit today and I was reading about what is the most like disturbing Stephen King thing you've ever read in any of his books or short stories, and it got me thinking, like, what books by authors that I love do I read that are so disturbing, and yet for some reason I continue to read them? So in this list of most disturbing books that I've ever read, you are not going to find the basics that most people would put into disturbing novels. Animal cruelty will not be in this. That's something that I find very disturbing, but it's also something that I find to be cheap horror. I think it's a very cheap way out to do animal cruelty because it disturbs just about everybody. And if you can't come up with something more meaningful, impactful, or creative, I find it to be very, very lazy writing. The same kind of goes with like torture for shock's sake, or any kind of abuse, especially towards women. That's not something I like reading about, and it's something that I will probably put a book down if it appears in the story that I'm reading, unless it really adds to the narrative and the character development. So I don't really have any of that in these books. A lot of these books will have trigger warnings, and I will talk about those. But these are all very disturbing books that I think are extremely well written, and despite how disturbing they were, I was compelled to keep reading the books. I may have had to put the books down for a little bit and take a break from what I read to digest it internally, but these are stories that the impact that the disturbing elements had stayed with me for days, weeks, even months, a couple of them years after I finished reading the book. And I think that's a very effective style, especially when you can get a greater meaning out of it. Now, when Juan first asked me to do the collaboration, I did my little segment for his video on Let the Right One In by Jean-Ovide Lindqvist. This is my favorite vampire novel of all time. This was a 4-star read for me, and it definitely should be a 5-star read, but there are so many disturbing elements in this that I was not able to give it the true 5 stars. I couldn't let myself. And you'll see that that's going to happen with a lot of the books in this list. But let's read the back of the book very quickly. So it says, 12-year-old Oscar is obsessed by the murder that's taken place in his neighborhood. Then he meets the new girl from next door. She's a bit weird though, and she only comes out at night. Alright, so this doesn't tell you much. Long story short, this is, in my opinion, and this might be a little bit of a spoiler, but this is just what I feel this book is. This is the origin story of a vampire's familiar, and I think it's a really interesting way because it is masqueraded as a romance. This book pays a lot of homage to Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, which, if you know about that novel, is extremely disturbing in and of itself, and even has a storyline that isn't our major storyline, definitely a very important side story that fully parallels the Lolita storyline, which I thought was brilliant. And just a lot of the elements of, I'm really not sure if it's pronounced Ellie or Eli, to be honest. The movie, it's Ellie, but it's spelled Eli. Anyhow, just the more you think about the character of our main vampire, and realize that though this character may be in a child's body, it does not have the mentality or maturity of a child. It has grown and lived and seen many more things. It starts to really make you question what the underlying tone of this book actually is. And it's one of those novels that on the surface level has some very, very deeply disturbing scenes, But after you shut the book and think about it and just kind of spiral more and more and more into the implications in this book, you realize it's about 100 times more scary and more disturbing than you initially thought it was, because it is not a romance, and I will die on that hill. This is not a romance novel at all. Do not care what people say. I think this is just a truly terrifying origin story for a vampire's familiar, and I think it's brilliant. Okay, next up, I know a lot of people have some thoughts on this book. I understand people's hesitations on this book, but this is Hex by Thomas Oiled Huyvelt. We got like two kind of like Nordic authors up here. He's Dutch, and Lindqvist is Swedish, but I love this book. This is brilliant and weird and creepy and disturbing. Does not stick the landing. This was a 4-star read for me as well. But it does have one extremely disturbing scene that came out of left field that I always go back to when I think about this book as just like this moment where it went from being like kind of like a fun, creepy story to a devastating horror tale. So I'll read the back for y'all. So it says, "Welcome to Black Spring, a seemingly picturesque Hudson Valley town haunted by the Black Rock Witch, a 17th century woman whose eyes and mouth are sewn shut. Muzzled, she walks the streets and enters homes at will. She stands next to children's beds for nights on end. Her eyes may never be opened, or the consequences will be too terrible to bear. The elders of Black Spring prevent the curse from spreading with high-tech surveillance. Frustrated by the lockdown, the town's teenagers break their strict regulations, and in doing so, send the town spiraling into depraved practices of the distant past." So what I find very scary about this novel is pretty much what I find scary about every single novel I'm going to talk about. And I didn't really touch too much on it when I was speaking about Let the Right One In, because I want you guys to kind of unravel that story on your own. But one of the themes that makes the Let the Right One In as disturbing as Hex is what evils the regular human can do. Because in all of these novels, what is most disturbing to me and what is most scary is what regular humans do who are unaware of kind of the supernatural evil that the main plot of the story is focusing on. Or like just what they could do if they harnessed that power. And I think Hex does a really interesting job of the relationship between one of our main characters and the kind of cliche bully. This is an archetype that's done over and over and over and over again, but I think is always stopped before it can get to that pivotal point of no return, especially in a lot of like film and TV. You see it really, really often. We're going to talk about it in a second again in It with Henry Bowers. But in Hex, it's kind of the idea of, what if the bully isn't stopped? What if we actualize the evil nature that has been in this teenage child? And will there be consequences? And I just remember reading the scene, and it's I believe in the like, it's definitely in the middle of the book, but I feel like it's towards like the latter half of the middle. And when I got to that scene in this novel, I just remember like putting the book down, having to take a pause, and being like, that didn't just happen. Like, that didn't just happen. For reference, I can tell you a lot of what happens in this book up until that scene, and then after that scene, everything else gets blurred because this was so climactic for me. I read this book 2 years ago, and I remember that was when I was like, I understand the brilliance of this novel. I know that a lot of people don't love the ending. I'm not the biggest fan of the ending, and I've heard that the Dutch version is different. Don't necessarily know if it's better, but because I haven't read it yet, nor do I know how to read Dutch, so we'll see if I ever do. But yeah, no, this was such a 180 in the story that I didn't believe that it was it was real when I read it. I thought that we were gonna wake up and everything was gonna be a dream that I just read. But no, Oiled Helvoet, I don't know how to say that name. I've tried so many times and I always mess it up. But he stayed true to it, and it is what actually happens. And I just remember being blown away by the evils that like an average teenager could have, and that character, you didn't question it. It happened, and you were just like, oh, yeah, like it was extreme, but I could see that happening in reality, and I think that was what disturbed me so much with that. So next up we have No One Gets Out Alive by Adam Neville. This is my favorite Adam Neville book, I believe. This was a 5-star read for me. I think this is brilliant. This is absolutely his most feminist and definitely his most claustrophobic. Let me read the back of the book for y'all really quickly. I know I've talked about this book a ton on my channel. When Stephanie moves to a notoriously cheap neighborhood off Birmingham, she's happy to find an affordable room for rent that's just large enough not to deserve her previous room's nickname, the Cell. The eccentric, albeit slightly overly friendly, landlord seems nice and welcoming. The ceilings are high and all of the other tenants are also girls. Things aren't great, but they're stable. Or at least, that's what she tells herself when she impulsively hands over the money to cover the first month's rent and decides to give it a go. But soon after, she becomes uneasy about her rash decision. She hears things in the night, feels them, things or people who aren't there in the light, who couldn't be there because, after all, her door is locked every night and the key is still in place in the morning. Concern soon turn to terror when the voices she hears and presence she feels each night become hostile. It's clear that something very bad has happened in this house, and something even worse is happening now. Stephanie has to find a way out, before whatever's going on in the house finds her first. No One Gets Out Alive will chill you straight through to the core, a cold, merciless, fear-inducing nightmare to the last page. A word of caution, don't read this one in the dark. Okay, this is great. Don't watch the movie on Netflix. I hated it. It was terrible. It takes everything that makes this book amazing and just throws it away. That being said, this book is told in 2 different parts. The first part is pretty much a ghost story. The second part really leads into like cosmic horror. But it's the first half of this book that I find so truly, deeply disturbing. Because if you take all of the supernatural elements out of this story and just read the story as if this happened in real life, it's absolutely downright terrifying. The way women are treated, the way women are isolated and exploited is so disturbing, and what fuels the men who do it is just mind-boggling. There's this weird element of almost like Stockholm Syndrome in this novel, and there's this weird element of like, if you can't beat them, join them, and it's just so intense and dark and bizarre, and our characters are really very, very strong. Female leads kind of placed into this bizarre, desperate situation. And I just really loved how Adam Neville was able to take a story and by almost putting the veil of like the supernatural over it, kind of gave you this blanket of safety of thinking like, okay, this couldn't ever actually happen because this is a ghost story. And then you kind of step back for a second and have to think, oh no, if you take the ghost out of this story, this is so much worse. And so I'm just going to leave it at that, but I absolutely adored this book. This is one of those novels that the more I stepped away from it, the more I really loved and appreciated it, especially the cosmic half at the end. It really just bolstered up the strengthening of our main character, which I thought was very, very necessary after all of the trauma that she went through. This book is just one big trigger warning, I will say that. Almost all of these books are, but this one probably not the most so, but definitely the most of the ones I've talked about so far, I would say. And it simulates claustrophobia really well, and a lot of the fear-inducing moments in this, again, are based on things because they can and do happen in reality, and I think that's what makes this ghost story just so elevated above the rest of Neville's work, where I feel like he leans so heavily into the supernatural that it kind of doesn't have that realism effect to like sit with you after you put the book down that this one does. And I just think he absolutely nailed this, and I love this book so much. It is so creepy, and it's hefty, but it is so worth reading. Okay, so I have talked about this book 1,000 times on my channel. This is my favorite book of all time, and I will always talk about this book if I have the chance to. In fact, I will now read the back of the book because I don't think I've ever done this on my channel. So this, by the way, if you can't tell, is It by Stephen King. Yay. Okay, so, to the children, the town was their world. To the adults, knowing better, Derry, Maine was just their hometown. Familiar, well-ordered, a good place to live. It was the children who saw and felt what made Derry so horribly different. In the storm drains and the sewers, it lurked, taking on the shape of every nightmare, each person's deepest dread. Sometimes it reached up, seizing, tearing, killing. The adults, knowing better, knew nothing. Time passed and the children grew up and moved away. The horror of it was deep buried, wrapped in forgetfulness, until the grown-up children were called back, once more to confront it as it stirred and coiled in the sullen depths of their memories, reaching up again to make their past nightmares a terrible present reality. Frightening, epic, and brilliant, Stephen King's It is one of the greatest works of a true storytelling master. Wow, that last sentence is really the only thing I want to take out of that, because the back of this book tells you nothing about how amazing this story is. But what I want to focus on in this story is, and I've talked about this many times on my channel, but the discrepancies between Henry Bowers and Patrick Hockstetter. Henry Bowers is kind of our cliche bully that I was talking about earlier. He terrorizes the main characters in this story. There are scenes where he tries to go too far, especially with like Ben Hanscom, and especially in the films, you will see that he gets stopped, right? He never actually gets to enact the evil that, if he had full reign, he probably could. However, then you meet his friend. I don't want to call him his best friend, even though he might be, but there are several of them, and this is the most terrifying, and that would be Patrick Hockstetter. I have said this many times on my channel. Patrick Hockstetter is the most terrifying literary character I have ever read about, and I stand by that. Patrick Hockstetter is scary because he is so believable and he is so real, and he is the only character in this entire story that is not influenced by Pennywise directly to be the evil that he is. His backstory, I read his backstory and I had to put the book down and I couldn't keep reading it. And then I kind of picked up the story again and read through like his present day climax of his character, his kind of, I don't want to ruin it for y'all, but just when Beverly finally gets to see who Patrick Hockstetter really is. And I remember reading that and just being like, wow, I didn't think it could get any worse, and somehow it did. And it's, I think there's like 2 or 3 chapters in this like 1600, how much is this? This 1200 page book dedicated just to Patrick Hockstetter, and I personally believe it is the most disturbing and most terrifying thing that Stephen King has ever written. That being said, this is a book that has the 3 most like disturbing moments I've ever read in a book. The first 2 chapters, obviously with Georgie, and then the first instance that we see Pennywise return to Derry, and then very deep in the book is the Patrick Hockstetter scene. And if you've never read it, I highly recommend reading this book, just to see how much they couldn't put into the films. There's so much horror that Stephen King has been edited out in modern cinema that I feel like we don't actually know as like a general consumer populace how terrifying a lot of Stephen King's work is. We just see things like Pet Sematary that have certain disturbing scenes here and there, or The Shining, which we don't really see anything of King in that, and just kind of write him off as a creepy author. But then when you read like the intricate details of these side characters in many of King's works, you can see just how depraved some of his writing is. And I think Patrick Hockstetter is the absolute perfect character for that. And I know I talk about that a lot on this channel, so I'm going to leave it at that and then talk about my final book, which is Gone to See the Riverman. Now this is very short. This was a 4-star read for me. This book deserves 5 stars. It will never get 5 stars from me because the content in this book is so deeply disturbing, unnerving, unsettling. Like, the more I think about this book, the queasier I get. But I will read the back of the book for y'all. So it says, superfans, groupies, stalkers. These people will give anything for the idols they worship, be they rock stars, actors, or authors, or even serial killers. Laurie's obsession is with Edmund Cox, who was convicted of butchering more than 20 women. She will do anything to get close to him, so when he gives her a task, she accepts. She has no idea of the horror that awaits her. Edmund says she must go to his cabin in the woods and retrieve a key to deliver to a mysterious figure known only as the Riverman. She brings along her sister, and the trip becomes a surreal nightmare, one that digs up Laurie's personal demons, and one she feels bonds her to Edmund. Soon she will learn the Riverman is not quite fact or folklore, and definitely not human. At least, not anymore. I've never had the tone in a book switch so rapidly as I had with Gone to See the Riverman. This is a very disturbing concept to begin with, and Christopher Triana just goes from 0 to 60 and just keeps accelerating. This book unravels into more depravity the deeper you get, and has this way of making you really sympathize for a character, and like just truly almost empathize with them, to be honest. And then within one page makes you hate every single thing about them. And again, there is a lot of cosmic horror in the story, but what makes this story truly terrifying is the backstories of our main characters. And I want to leave it at that because I do think that this book is most effective if you go into it blind. But I do want to point out that this book is, again, nothing but trigger warnings, and hands down the most incredibly disturbing, unsettling, just depraved book that I've ever read. And all of that depravity becomes apparent through the selfishness of humanity. And I think that's what's so creepy about this. There is... I'm not even sure how to go on talking about this. There's something about this book in which it is so well written and the characters are so well crafted and laid out before you that you don't want to stop reading this book. And there's so many moments of just like universal karma that kind of come up that you don't feel compelled to stop reading. Like you want to know what happens. You want to know if people get what's coming to them, and you need to see how and why and where it's all going. And it's written in this really almost like, I don't want to say beautiful, but like very like old school kind of folky style where you really just kind of love this weird, unsure, I believe it's in Alabama, like river journey. And seeing where it takes you, but at the same time everything is just spiraling out of control, and just the selfishness of humankind in the story is truly unforgivable. And I just remember being absolutely blown away when I read it, and I could not believe that somebody came up with this, like that this came out of their mind. Christopher Triana is a truly amazingly talented writer, and we should be talking about his work way more often than we do. But I know I've spoken about this on my channel a bunch. This might be the best book I've read all year. I really did enjoy Ronald Malfi's Blackmouth, but this one had so much more of an impact on me than any other book that I've read this year. And at the same time, it also kind of made me want to throw up when I was reading it because of just how horrible it was to read. But I do think it's brilliant, and almost in like the vein of Nabokov's Lolita, there is this great literary merit to what you're reading, and it is very intriguing storytelling, even if the subject matter is absolutely horrific and the people you are reading about are absolutely terrifying. So I will just leave it at that. But those are 5 extremely disturbing books that I highly recommend, in which the disturbing elements elevate the book instead of just being disturbing for disturbing sakes, and to just kind of give you like a Saw Part 6 kind of cash grab, as I would say. But yeah, so thank you guys so much for watching. As always, I post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays. And if you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and I will catch you on the next one. Wow.